You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello and welcome to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Naseem and I will be your host for today's conversation. We are discussing Palestine in the post-Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is, as many believe, a defining moment in terms of geopolitics and will reverberate for decades to come. If we are, as some say, standing in a fork in the road moment, what does it mean for the Palestinian cause in the post-Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine? To discuss this important topic, I am joined by Dr. Ramzy Baroud to discuss the fallout and what it means for the Palestinians. Ramzy is the editor of the Palestine Chronicle and author of 5 books. His latest is Our Vision for Liberation: Engaged Palestinian Leaders and Intellectuals Speak Out. Baroud is also a non-resident senior research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs and also at the Afro-Middle East Center. Welcome to the show, Ramzy, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Naseem. It's such a great pleasure to be with you and your wonderful show, and just to be back speaking to friends from Middle East Monitor.
Yeah, thank you, and for those nice, kind words. Let's begin, if we may, with a look at some of the wider ramifications. Of course, there is the usual talk in many websites and news sites about this being the end of US dominance and the end of the unipolar moment. In terms of the big picture, the great game, so to speak, what has captivated you most over the past month?
Well, it's really been quite interesting just watching the world kind of, change and possibly irreversibly change before our own eyes. It's very important to remember, though, that that change did not come with the American or the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, or even the Russian invasion of Georgia. These are quite relatively recent events. The change have been taking place for a long time, particularly with the American invasion of Iraq. And now we are kind of commemorating the anniversary of that horrific invasion and the killings of millions of Iraqis, Arabs, and Muslims in the Middle East as a result of the invasions, but also the consequences of that invasion that spiraled throughout the region. I think it's important to remember that the Americans went to Iraq because they were afraid that the new century will not be American. And this is the whole premise, actually, of the neoconservative movement behind the American invasion of Iraq. They wanted to, for the new American, in fact, the project for the new American century, which is kind of the ideology, if you will, of the neoconservatives, was making the argument very clear. We are in Iraq in order for us to secure the energy reserves of the Middle East and in the service of American political strategies in Asia. And they made it very, very clear that China, India, and Russia were these kind of the enemies that the US have been trying to kind of keep out of the region and ensure continued American dominance. Now, the Iraq war was a complete disaster, and we don't want to delve too much into that, but I don't think there's anyone out there with, any sensible ideas can possibly argue that the Iraq war was a success. But what we're experiencing in the Ukraine right now is kind of the fallout of that American failure. The US leadership in the Middle East have been compromised. In 2012, Barack Obama has decided to change course entirely by inventing the new doctrine of the so-called pivot to Asia. China is the new enemy as far as the Americans were concerned. That has been consistent in American political thinking, regardless of who was in charge, whether a Democrat or a Republican. the Trump administration more or less followed the same agenda set by the Democrats under Obama and so forth. Now there has been this kind of opening in geopolitics internationally. The US position is no longer in the driving seat. The US can no longer dictate political outcomes, at least not the way they used to in the past. For example, the intervention in Libya, the war in Libya by NATO, the US invented this new caveat where they were not the primary invaders, but they termed it as such, leadership from behind or something of that nature, because they are no longer able to start major military conflicts, sustain these conflicts, and read the geopolitical outcomes of these conflicts. So naturally, someone else had to make that move, and that's where Russia has calculated that it is time for them to advance their geopolitical position by invading Ukraine. I don't think it was entirely a surprise. Maybe the extent of the Russian intervention in Ukraine is a bit of a surprise, but the Russian move itself has been somewhat calculated and somewhat predicted. Russia was about to move a piece in this geopolitical game that could be devastating to American and European interests in Eastern Europe.
I wonder if I can broaden this question out a bit more. You spoke about the US abandoning the Middle East under Obama and Trump to some extent as well, allowing Russia to enter Middle East through the Syrian war, and we saw the bloodletting, as a result of that. Biden, over the weekend, he gave his speech where he said that America, this is going to be the Great Reset. This is going to be the war for making American prominence once more. The 21st century will still remain a century for the Americans. So he's speaking in those terms that every 40 years or 50 years, there's a shift in the tide, and there is a struggle for domination within the geopolitical game that's played every 4 or 5 decades. And Biden seems very optimistic that the 21st century will remain a century where US dominance is still preeminent. But I wonder if you think the US has left itself too much to do, having abandoned the Middle East, having allowed Russia to come in via the Syrian war, having also allowed Chinese influence to permeate, dominate through the Middle East, where China is now the biggest investor in the Middle East, way beyond anything the US is doing. Has it left too much to do? And are we really seeing a change in the geopolitical preeminence within the Middle East?
That's right. I mean, we'll talk about the Great Reset in a second here, but what you mentioned about China, I mean, isn't it ironic that the US went to Iraq in order for them to kind of occupy that extremely strategic energy source and geopolitical region, and invest that piece of pie that they stole illegally from the Iraqi people to advance American interests in the Middle East and beyond the Middle East. And here we have it that it's China that's actually Iraq's largest trade partner. And a few months ago, and I do believe I wrote about this for Middle East Monitor as well, China and Iraq signed a contract where the Chinese government will build 1,000 schools throughout the country. I just imagine the psychology of this, just the fact that China is not only here to stay, but and reaping the benefits of American foolishness in Iraq, but it's also not investing in bombs and not investing in complete devastation of Iraqi neighborhoods and cities like Fallujah, Basra, Baghdad, and so forth. But they're actually building schools, which is kind of long-term investment. So now back to the term, the Great Reset. I mean, the brand itself, you wouldn't talk about a reset unless you acknowledge that there has been a problem. Otherwise, why are we resetting? If everything was good and dandy, why are we trying to reset press that button and go back. Now the question is, go back to what? What the Americans have been trying to tell us is that they want to reset, past the prior to the Trump, destruction more or less, or jeopardizing the U.S. Relations with its allies, whether in the European Union, whether in NATO, whether even their traditional allies in the Middle East, and so forth. But that is the wrong assumption, because that makes the argument, or that makes it appear as if the problem started with NATO, with Trump. But in fact, this is not the case at all. American leadership was suffering among their European allies for many years, and for years prior to Trump, for sure. In fact, in some ways, Trump is not the cause, but a symptom of that unhealthy relationship where the Americans are no longer able to lead NATO or lead the West towards sustainable economic models, towards economic prosperity, and so forth and so on. So Trump came here in order for him to show that that America can survive without its Western allies, including Canada to the north and so forth, and we need a whole new thinking. Now, this is not a Trump idea. This is an idea that exists as part of the American body politic, and it's championed by many others within the Republican Party, but also within the Democrats as well. So just simply because Biden goes to Europe and he declares a great reset, it doesn't mean anything practically. The Europeans are very wary of the Americans. In fact, the American behavior on the Ukraine right now is another reason of why the Europeans are very, very wary, that the Americans are using Europe in order for the Americans to achieve whatever political and geopolitical interests they have in mind, at the expense of the stability of Europe, at the expense of the economic prosperity and the energy safety of Europe. So that kind of, in a way, what's happening right now, it confirms and reaffirms European concerns that the Americans are no longer in a position of leadership, and what is good for America is no longer good for Europe.
I think that's very much true. And I think a lot of people have it the wrong way around when they look at the Obama administration, Trump administration, thinking this is the cause of the American decline from the Middle East or withdrawal from the Middle East. If anything, it's actually it's the symptom of a much deeper problem within the American-led global system. We've spoken a little bit about the big geopolitical issues. I wonder if we can now zoom into Palestine and look at what this means for the Palestinian cause. Because as we know, during major conflicts, Palestinians tend to come off worse off. We can look back at, for example, the 1990-91 Gulf War, which where Palestinians were more or less pushed out of the Middle East because of their position on the Gulf War. And then in Iraq in 2003, Palestinians suffered a lot. Syria, Hamas forced out or left Syria. So in many of these major conflicts, we see Palestinians being pushed into a corner. So what are you most fearful of in this time of shift and change in the global dynamic? Is there something you are concerned about specifically when it comes to how Palestinians align themselves in this great game, as so to speak?
Right, and it's an excellent question, and I wish I feel like there is an opportunity for optimism, but I don't have, as you already know, Nasim, I don't have much faith in the Palestinian leadership that they would actually be able to utilize whatever space that is opening up, whatever marginal space that's opening up for them to kind of revisit their past mistakes. Let's remember that the first geopolitical loss for Palestinians was the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And we kind of saw that happening in the way that the Americans basically claimed the seat of leadership as far as kind of guiding and controlling the any talks or any discussions or the politics of Palestine and Israel. We saw that in the after that war, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans held the Madrid talks under their sponsorship, where Palestinians and other Arab countries came together to negotiate with Israel, but of course on Israeli terms and under the guarantee of the United States. In Madrid, there was still some relevance to international law, but it was no longer the condition, meaning that Palestinians and Israelis were free to create a new dimension to whatever solution they had in mind that goes beyond UN Resolution 242, 338, 181, 194, all these kind of the fundamentals of the Palestinian political struggle. So there has always been a link between a major change happening at the global scene and how it affects and reflects on Palestinians. Remember, after 2003, the same thing happened. Two things actually happened. One was Palestinians were expelled from Iraq. Yes, we did not have a very large community. There were about 30 to 50,000 Palestinians, but you would wonder, why are Palestinians paying the price for the American invasion of Iraq? They were chased out of the country. They lived in refugee camps near the Iraq-Jordan border, the Syria-Iraq border, and eventually many of them ended up in South America and elsewhere. So there is always this element of Palestinians paying the price for any conflict that happens in the region, regardless of whether they have any role to play, and oftentimes they actually don't. The second element was the roadmap to peace that is of George W. Bush. Whenever the Americans create a new political reality or win a tussle between them and another great country, they somehow find a reason to try to rearrange the politics that's happening at a regional level, whether in the Middle East, in South America, or anywhere else. And that's exactly what they did. George W. Bush's roadmap to peace came with guarantees to Sharon, Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, that the US will not be pressuring Israel in any way, major settlements will not be dismantled, and so forth and so on. So there's always that element. But what's happening right now is different, because this is not an American war. The Americans are trying to claim Ukraine as an opportunity, trying to make it an American war. But in actuality, it's not. And I don't think, no matter how much weapons the Americans dump in there, in the Ukraine, I don't think it will actually eventually be an American war, which means that the Americans are now, for the first time in many years, and I would say since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans are on the defensive. What we witnessed in the last couple of days of the Emir of Emirate Mohammed ibn Zayed, along with the President of Egypt, Sisi, and Naftali Bennett, the Israeli Prime Minister, meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh was an indication that the region, or the former American allies, current to some extent American allies in the regions, are now trying to fathom the future of the region and their dominance of the region past American diktats and past American priorities. This is earth-shattering, in my opinion, what's happening. There's a lot of fear that the changes that will happen at a global scale would eventually affect the Middle East, and it's sure it will, because of how significant and strategic the Middle East in terms of energy supplies, oil, gas, etc. So there is a lot of repositioning that's happening politically, because the US is no longer in the driving seat and they cannot control the situation the way they did for decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, this is where the Palestinians come in. Now, the Palestinians have had lots of supports coming from Russia, from the Soviets and from Russia. Even
Ramzy, if I may just intervene, we want to get to that later on, how Palestinians can navigate the terrain on a global scale, given the changes taking place. But I wanted to just ask one more question about the initial Palestinian response, or the PA's response to this, where they've you mentioned in one of your pieces that they've rejected Biden's call to condemn Russia. So I wonder if you think that they're playing a dangerous game here, because If it turns out that Russia, things go awry and the invasion becomes prolonged and it becomes bloody and horrible, will Palestinians once again not be seen as kind of supporting a losing horse in this game? And so is the PA playing a dangerous game here, do you think? I just wanted you to just focus on that a little bit and then speak to that.
Right. Well, I mean, in a way, the Americans have kind of burned many of their cards with the Palestinians. I mean, by denying them funds for years, by denying funds that went to UNRWA, that the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, they kind of created a precedent here. And the precedent is that the Americans cannot be trusted. Of course, you would say Palestinians should have figured this a long time ago, that the Americans cannot be trusted. But, we have a leadership that doesn't really kind of has a whole different, stream of logic, and it behaves according to its own interests and its own priorities. But the fact that the Palestinian Authority did survive, it didn't collapse, it did survive without American funds for years, indicates that they can do it again. It wouldn't be easy, but they can actually manage somehow. Now, the question is this: what are the cards that the Americans have over the Palestinians aside from money? Yes, there's an element of political validation, but the Palestinian political validation comes from so many countries, including Venezuela, including Iran, including many other countries, not just from the Americans and NATO and the Western camp. Therefore, that balancing act that the Palestinians found themselves in could actually, serve them, could be utilized to their advantage if they know how to do things right. Now, the worst case scenario, if for the Americans, is to say to the Palestinians, we are not going to be giving you money anymore. But if they do so, they risk political instability in the West Bank. They risk a rift between the PA and Israel as far as security coordinations are concerned. So they actually stand to lose more than they stand to gain if they try to punish the Palestinians as a result of trying at least to play this balancing act at the moment.
And if we assume for a moment that Russia may emerge stronger, and Russia will have a lot more to say on the Palestinian issue, what do you think is, when I say Russia, I mean also by extension China, what would a Russia-China-led peace process for the Palestinians look like in your view? Because as we know, the so-called peace process has failed for decades, led by the US, has failed by decades. But do you think a US, China, Russia-led effort to solve the Palestinian issue would have much greater credibility and chance than the one the US has been trying for many decades?
Right. So I think there are way too many moving parts as far as that possibility is concerned. But naturally, in whenever there is a political equilibrium between great countries, that usually serves the interests of small countries. I mean, we are already seeing that manifesting itself in Venezuela and Cuba, and even in the case of Iran, in fact, particularly in the case of Iran. So that would definitely serve the Palestinian interests, again, if they know how to use this opening space to their advantage. The issue here is that Russia has traditionally and historically maintained quite a strong pro-Palestine stance, even though after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that stance was directly linked to international law, but it still sustains its support for Palestinians. It's just that Russia has been the much weaker party as far as the Middle East so-called peace process is concerned. And even the role in the so-called quartet for peace involving the United Nations, Europe, the US, and Russia also has been quite marginal. Now, will Russia try to redefine its role in whatever political platforms that exist? Shall it emerge stronger? And I think the answer is yes, because Russia is very, very keen on creating a permanent presence for itself in the Middle East, not just militarily, but politically as well. Of course, it all depends on how things will work out not just in the Ukraine, but also regarding the future of Syria, because that's where much of the geopolitical leverage that Russia has comes from the outcome of the current Syrian conflict.
I mean, of course, Palestinians are not one monolithic group. You have many different groups and factions. So I wanted to ask, I mean, are there different positions with regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine within the Palestinian hierarchy? Has Hamas taken a different position to, say, Fatah and the PA generally? What are the different views regarding that?
Not as fundamental as one may think. Yes, there is the choice of words has been particularly interesting, where Hamas is making it very clear that the US should, is a country that has sustained and supported and funded the Israeli occupation and is no longer in a, it's not in a position of teaching anyone about ethics or respect of international law or war and peace and that sort of thing. But no one has really taken as of yet a position of total alliance or support with any of the countries involved here. Even the Palestinian Authority itself, we hear from people who are closely affiliated with the Palestinian Authority and with the PLO that are making it clear that we are under a lot of pressure, but we will not be changing our position, neutral position, anytime soon. We believe dialogue, not war, is going to bring peace to the Ukraine and so forth. And anything beyond that would be considered political suicide for the Palestinian Authority that wants to maintain strong ties with Russia as well.
One of the things that's been surprised me actually is the ways countries like Iran, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia, they're able to extract benefit and take the positive and use this and exploit the situation to their advantage. Because as we know, the Western governments have gone to Venezuela in a major U-turn to convince them to produce more oil, to Iran as well. And I think within that context, you had Nazarene Radcliffe, who was released as part of that negotiation. Saudi Arabia as well, refusing to pump more oil, waiting for a much better time so prices rise. So what do Palestinians need to do, in your view, the leadership, to actually exploit the situation, to make sure that they can extract the most benefit they can in this situation of transformation and change within the global order?
I think the first step and the most important step is for Palestinians to develop a strategy that, and I know this may sound laughable considering that we have been talking about Palestinian unity for years and it doesn't seem like we are going anywhere closer to that goal, but we really need to be unified in this particular moment. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that we are going to find ourselves kind of falling once more in the various spheres of influence of whatever that political outcome that's going to result from the Ukraine war. And we've been there before in the past, especially regionally. First, we have been there globally, where the socialist movements, Palestinian socialist movements, allied with Russia, with the Soviet Union in the past, and the others had their other spheres of influence, to the point that the Islamists fought against the communists, and the communists were allied with other Palestinians and so forth. So it's really been quite a mess. In other words, we have failed in the past to utilize geopolitical changes to our favor. Now, regionally, that also hurt us so much. Every Arab country, namely Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Libya, even Algeria, had a Palestinian political party in the past that were close to the seats of power. And they used that specific Palestinian party to create whatever, to benefit the interests of that particular government, even if that goes against the interests of the Palestinian people. Now, if we are going to continue with that mindset, it's going to be a big, big problem, because the world is entering into a new stage of new spaces and new spheres of influence, and that, multipolarity, in fact, not even bipolarity. We might end up in a bipolar scenario at one point, but I think the next stage is going to be that of multipolarity, because China is not going to simply concede leadership to Russia, nor Russia is going to 100% trust China in the coming years, but we don't know how things will fall. Now, will the Palestinians end up just basically, just be there, offering themselves as a potential ally to this government and that government? If we do that, it's going to be another big mess. However, we do have the option of at least creating, let's not be too optimistic here. If we can at least coordinate our political actions and statements and moves to have a unified position regarding this particular issue just for the next year or so, this could in fact give us more credibility and more space and more advantage. And let's not forget that Russia has tried in recent years to host Palestinian national unity talks, and they have done so successfully. It didn't result in much, but it showed that Russia was keenly interested to dig deeper and to delve deeper within the Palestinian, within the inner Palestinian conflict as well. But sadly, when the Americans renewed their funding to the Palestinian Authority, when Biden became a president, Moscow called on Hamas and Fatah to come back to Russia, and Fatah said no, because now they are getting paid handsomely by the Americans. This is tragic. This is one of the biggest geopolitical mistakes any party can make. You are basically saying we are available for a certain price, and we can only manipulate the market if the price is not right, but we are willing to play along if the price is right. We have to change that mindset. Otherwise, this outcome not only will not serve Palestinians in the future, but it could actually turn against Palestinians as well.
Yeah, I hope we can have a Palestinian leadership able to navigate this for the Palestinian people. But before we finish, this is my last question. I wanted to turn our attention to not Palestine, but Palestinian global solidarity, which is a phenomenon in itself, and look at the advantages it can, from this conflict, and if it can exploit the situation in the sense that, boycott is now something which is accepted and, called for by everyone in the West. Occupation is understood that it's a criminal offense, it's illegal under international law, and no country should be violating the sovereignty of another country. This is a major debate around the world. And also racism is a major issue, as we've seen over the last month or so. So within that context, are you optimistic that this can be used by the global Palestinian solidarity to make the case in a much more powerful and more stronger way to defend the Palestinian cause all over the world?
Right. So yes, of course, I am optimistic in the sense that there are many individuals, organizations, entities out there that are supporting, that they are, rejecting the Russian invasion of the Ukraine based on moralistic and human rights and legal paradigms. It is these people that I think we should be working with to make that comparison and say, well, look at the Palestinians. We have been occupied for 75 years and we have been victims of ethnic cleansing, and international law has been very, very clear about this, but not only nothing has happened to reverse this horrific cycle, but Europe is actually sustaining and supporting the illegal Jewish settlements, and they are paying for the weapons that are killing the Palestinians and so forth and so on. So this is going to be helpful in terms of expanding the outreach of the boycott movement and creating more friends and more allies with the Palestinians, but we shouldn't be too optimistic regarding whether that is going to change the mindset of the political entities that are being accused of being hypocritical, whether in the sports or politics or diplomacy or banking and so forth. They know exactly what they are doing. It's not like it's just gonna dawn on them all of a sudden that, wait a minute, but Palestinians have been dying for decades, but look what's happening in Yemen, look what's happening in Libya. That's not gonna happen. They know exactly what's going on, and their position is purely political and selfish position. But one last thing I would like to add to that, Nassim. I was particularly impressed by the speech of the Pakistani president at the Organization of Islamic Countries the other day. The need, that he described the need to kind of revisit and negotiate a better position for all of us in this new political climate. And he mentions Palestine, on top of his agenda. And I think that's where the other opportunities lie, is that we need, in the Palestine solidarity movement, we need to diversify. I know that there's a lot of things that are being achieved in Africa at the moment, but we need to diversify beyond this constant emphasis on Europe. European everything, this centrality of Europe in the Palestinian discourse, and America, of course, the West, in the Palestinian discourse, haven't really been of great benefit to Palestinians in the last 4 decades or so. So we need to diversify. The world exists beyond the boundaries of Europe and the United States and Canada, and it exists all over. And we need to work with Indonesia, Malaysia, of course, China, Russia, Turkey, rest of Africa and South America. These are the bread and butter of Palestinian solidarity in the last 75 years. So maybe this is our opportunity to actually try to revisit and relink our struggle with their struggles and with their politics, with the hope that we could indeed create that international momentum to end Israeli apartheid, racism, and occupation of Palestine.
I think it's a good note to end on, and I'm glad you raised the issue of Imran Khan, Pakistan's prime minister, who spoke about marginalized communities like, of course, the Palestinians, Uyghur Muslims in China, and Kashmir, of course, and the need to ensure their safety and protect their rights and get the international community to respond. And I think your emphasis that Palestinians should lead in making sure that they are the ones who chart their course in the shifting sands of global geopolitics, rather than be someone who's subjected to the rules and whims of foreign superpower, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, whether it be the Americans. And I'm hopeful, and I think we will have courageous Palestinians who should be able to navigate that. But there's lots to look out for, and like you, I will be, observing things in detail on the Palestinian side, and of course more broadly. I want to thank you, of course, for your insight and your thoughts, for joining us and giving us your time. And I want to also thank the viewers at home for tuning in, and hopefully we can have another conversation soon on a similar topic. So thank you, Dr. Ramzy, and thank you at home for joining us. Bye-bye.
Assalamu alaikum. Bye-bye.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.